Hey guys, tonight we are going to explore one of the most cursed love histories of all time. King Henry VIII and the 6 brave souls who unfortunately stepped into his bedroom of destiny, but hardly any survived to tell the tale. If you ever thought dating was hard, this story will leave you speechless. Prepare yourselves for a series of tragedies, divorces, beheadings and exiles, to convents lurking just behind those velvet curtains. And seriously, by the numbers, becoming one of his 6 wives was literally a gamble with your life. So, before you relax, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I create. And leave a comment below letting me know which city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I want to see who's joining this late-night adventure. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in a foreign land not just as a bride, but as a symbol, Princess of Spain, daughter of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. The year is 1501. You are only 15 years old, barely past childhood, when you step onto English soil to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales. It is a union forged not from affection but diplomacy, a powerful alliance between 2 kingdoms meant to secure peace and glory across Europe. The wedding is grand. Your gown, heavy with gold thread, glitters under the candlelight of St. Paul's Cathedral. You walk with the grace taught to you since infancy, chin high, gaze steady. The court watches, admires. But behind the celebration lies a chill in the air, a feeling you cannot quite name. Arthur, delicate and reserved, is not the prince of your dreams. He is pale, often ill, and the chill in Ludlow Castle only makes things worse. Mere months after your marriage, a sudden sickness sweeps through the region. It strikes without mercy. Your young husband, your new life, your role as future queen all gone in a heartbeat. You are left alone. A widow before you can even become a wife, in truth. They allow you to stay in England, not out of kindness, but necessity. You are now a political pawn stranded between courts. For 7 long years you linger neither queen nor guest, a princess without a throne. Your Spanish attendants slowly return home. The halls grow colder. You pray. You write letters. You wait. Then comes Henry Arthur's younger brother, broad-shouldered, golden-haired, and still a boy when you last saw him. In 1509, he becomes king. 18 years old, full of energy and ambition. He decides to marry you. Some call it love. Others call it duty. You say nothing. You nod. You smile. You accept. The marriage feels like a sunrise. At first, you are Queen of England. You stand beside Henry, proud and radiant. The people cheer. You dare to believe in joy again. But almost immediately, a shadow returns. The need for an heir. A son. A prince. Your womb is no longer your own. It belongs to the future of the Tudor dynasty. You conceive. The court rejoices. But the child is stillborn. You conceive again. The baby, a boy, breathes briefly, then fades away like mist at dawn. The pattern repeats: hope, loss, silence. Every pregnancy a prayer, every miscarriage a funeral, whispered behind palace walls. You carry the grief alone. Henry is kind at first. He holds your hand. He kneels beside you in chapel. But his eyes begin to wander. His advisors begin to whisper. Why can't the Queen give him a son? Your body becomes a battlefield. You fast. You confess. You walk barefoot on cold stone floors. You offer every suffering to God, and yet no heir survives. Only one child lives. Mary, a girl, strong and bright. But she is not enough. Not to them, not to him. Years pass. The court changes. You age. Your beauty fades. Henry grows distant. He is no longer the boy who smiled at you with admiration. Now he looks at you with doubt, with disappointment, with calculation. One day, he tells you he believes your marriage is cursed, that because you were once married to his brother, your union is a sin. He claims Leviticus forbids it. He says he cannot live in damnation. You plead, you argue. You remind him of your sacrifices, your devotion. He does not listen. What follows is not a divorce. It is a dismantling of everything you were. He strips you of your title. He banishes you from court. You are sent to a cold and crumbling manor. Your daughter is taken from you, declared illegitimate. You are forbidden to see her. In the end, you are left with a stone floor, a wooden cross, and fading memories of when you were queen. But you never renounce your title. Not once. In every letter, you sign as Catherine, Queen of England. You refuse to call yourself anything less. You die alone, not unloved, but unacknowledged. Yet in history's quiet shadow, you remain the first wife, faithful, dignified, and broken not by scandal, but by sorrow. Henry VIII, a man unaccustomed to rejection, was quickly captivated by Anne Boleyn, a woman unlike any he had ever encountered. Intelligent, sharp-witted, and fiercely independent, Anne refused to be just another mistress like her sister Mary. She declared boldly that she would give herself only to the king if she were crowned queen. That unwavering stance sparked not just a royal infatuation but a religious and political upheaval that would shake Europe. Driven by both desire and pride, Henry sought to annul his marriage to Catherine, his wife of nearly 2 decades. But Pope Clement VII refused to grant the divorce. That denial turned a love affair into a revolution. In the year 1534, Henry founded the Church of England, naming himself its supreme head, breaking ties with the Vatican. Just a year later, in 1533, he married Anne in a dazzling ceremony that shocked the continent, yet their romantic dreams soon curdled into nightmare. All hope rested on Anne's shoulders. She had to deliver a male heir to secure the Tudor legacy. But their first child was a girl, Elizabeth. Though Elizabeth would grow into one of England's greatest monarchs, her birth was met with disappointment. Anne's subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriages, each one eroding the king's patience and the court's confidence. Suspicion turned to hostility. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's cunning and ambitious minister, saw Anne as a political threat. With calculated ruthlessness, he orchestrated a deadly plot. Accusing Anne of adultery with several men, including her own brother, though the charges were implausible, they led to a rigged trial. In the year 1536, Anne was arrested at night, charged with treason, and beheaded just days later. Anne's tragic end was more than a personal loss. It was a reflection of Henry's unchecked power. He could alter centuries of church doctrine, abandon the woman he once defied the Pope to marry, and end her life when affection turned to disfavour. In less than 3 years, Anne Boleyn rose to the pinnacle of power, and then fell to the block, becoming a silent ghost in the ever-turning wheel of Tudor ambition. And the court moved on, leaving behind only broken dreams and blood-stained history. After the storm that swept Anne Boleyn away, Jane Seymour emerged as a gentle, seemingly harmless figure. She embodied the Tudor court's image of the perfect wife. No rivalry, no bold declarations, no political intrigues, just humility and quiet obedience. Unlike Anne, sharp and fiery, Jane hid behind meekness, knowing that silence could be the sharpest weapon in a court where every whisper could become a dagger. Henry, consumed by fury and humiliation over Anne's betrayal, found in Jane the complete opposite, quiet comfort. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, only lowered her eyes and smiled, and Henry was utterly captivated. When Anne was dethroned, Jane swiftly filled the void, soothing both the king's bruised pride and the political fractures of the realm. The pinnacle came in the year 1537. After 2 agonizing days of labor, Jane gave birth to Prince Edward, the long-awaited son Henry had yearned for. Church bells rang, celebrations erupted, and smiles spread across the kingdom. The Tudor court felt cleansed of years of disappointment. At last, Henry had his legitimate heir, and Jane, in that fleeting moment, stood as the triumphant queen. But the radiance faded quickly. 12 days after childbirth, Jane died of postnatal complications. What had been jubilation turned into mourning. Henry grieved deeply, yet his grief polished her memory into myth. He often claimed Jane was the only wife truly loved, but that love was sealed by death. Jane was buried beside him, the sole queen granted that honour. She was remembered not for her intellect or her spirit, but simply as the mother of a future king. The cost of glory was life itself. With her softness and silence, Jane accomplished what Catherine and Anne could not, producing the longed-for heir. Yet her sacrifice revealed a harsh truth of the Tudor court. The royal bedchamber was never about love. It was a battlefield, where survival and legacy were bought with flesh and blood. Political ambition never slept in the Tudor court. This time, it led Henry to Anne of Cleves, a princess from the land of Luther, where the Protestant Reformation was blooming. Their marriage was arranged not out of love, but as a diplomatic maneuver, a Protestant alliance against Catholic powers. When the portrait painted by Hans Holbein arrived, Henry was immediately enchanted. The gentle features, the modest demeanour, every stroke of the brush, convinced him she was the jewel fit for his throne. But reality was cruel. When Anne set foot in England and Henry met her face to face, his disappointment was crushing. Instead of the beauty in the portrait, Henry saw a stranger who did not meet his desires. He spat harsh words, declaring her unfit for the marriage bed, a brutal verdict for any queen. In an instant, the political marriage became a diplomatic embarrassment. Yet unlike Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn, Anne of Cleves did not resist, did not demand. She understood perfectly that she was a pawn on the board. And instead of clinging to a fragile crown, she chose the wiser path: negotiation. She agreed to a quiet annulment in exchange for a generous settlement and the title of the king's beloved sister. It was not a downfall, it was an escape. After only 6 short months, the marriage was dissolved. But Anne was not exiled, not disgraced. On the contrary, she retained her place in the royal circle as if she were family. She attended Henry's later weddings, sat at his grand feasts, and lived in comfort and wealth until her death in the year 1557. Anne of Cleves left no princes or princesses behind. She did not ignite great political shifts. Yet her wisdom and adaptability turned her brief story into something remarkable. While other wives were exiled, executed, or lost to childbirth, Anne became the sole survivor. She triumphed not through power, but through prudence. Not by fighting, but by mastering the subtle art of survival. And then came Catherine Howard, a girl of just 16, born into the powerful Howard family, stepping onto the brutal stage of Tudor history. She was young, full of vitality, her eyes bright with innocence, her heart still naive, unprepared for the tangled webs of courtly intrigue. In the year 1540, she became the wife of Henry VIII, a king already aged, weary, and broken in both body and spirit. Their wedding was celebrated with grandeur, filled with candlelight and music, yet beneath the splendour lay fragility. Henry flaunted Catherine like a fresh bloom, proof that his masculine vigour had not yet faded. But Catherine could not endure the golden cage. Her young heart drifted back to Francis Dereham, an old love, not fully extinguished, a flame from her past she could not let go. In secret, she clung to those memories. More dangerously, she entered into an affair with Thomas Culpeper, one of the king's handsome courtiers. It was not merely reckless, it was tragically naive. Catherine did not yet understand that in the Tudor court, every whisper had an ear, every secret a price in blood. When the truth surfaced, Henry's fury was relentless. He was no longer the strong man of earlier years, but an aging king, heavy, embittered, and obsessed with betrayal. Catherine was charged with adultery, and in those times, adultery with the king was not just betrayal of marriage, but high treason. There was no way back, no defence to be made. Her death sentence was sealed swiftly, as if the outcome had been written long before. In the year 1542, Catherine Howard was led to the scaffold. She trembled, tears streaming, pleading, weeping bitterly. Before her the executioner's blade gleamed cold beneath a grim sky. The drums beat, the crowd murmured, and her young heart pounded its last. In her final moments, Catherine collapsed before the block, and with a single stroke, her brief life ended, carrying away a youth that had scarcely begun to bloom. The death of Catherine Howard stands as a sorrowful testament to the fragility of youth when confronted with the merciless machinery of power. She lacked the political experience to navigate the treacherous court, lacked the caution to protect herself within its dangers, and was ultimately destroyed by her own choices. Her tragedy echoes still. In the world of the Tudors, youth and love were never enough to shield a woman from the ruthless weight of the crown. Catherine Parr, the 6th wife of Henry VIII, entered his life when the king was already old, sick, and as changeable as a restless wind. Born in the year 1512, Catherine had already been widowed twice before she ever set foot in the Tudor court. She was no naive maiden, but a seasoned woman, educated, fluent in Latin, devoted to religious texts, and well aware of the theological debates shaking Europe. When chosen by Henry to be his queen in the year 1543, Catherine did not pursue favour or flaunt her power. Instead, she chose a wiser path, that of a caretaker. She read to the king during his weary nights, tended to the festering ulcers on his swollen legs, and with quiet grace, slipped her reformist ideas into their private conversations. Catherine understood boundaries, knowing when to fall silent, when to show agreement, and when to plant a thought like a seed in Henry's mind. Yet her passion for books and religion placed her in peril. In a court teeming with spies and rivals, any volume in her library could become evidence of heresy. Rumours spread more than once that the Chancellor and his allies had prepared a warrant for her arrest, waiting to drag her to the scaffold. But Catherine did not falter. When Henry began to doubt her, she humbled herself, apologizing, claiming she sought only to comfort the king in his sickness, not to challenge his faith. Her deft humility swayed Henry, who rescinded the order and spared her life by a hair's breadth. Amidst political storms, Catherine Parr was not only Henry's last wife, but also the one who outlived him. Her greatest achievement was not mere survival, but restoring Elizabeth and Mary to the line of succession, two daughters once branded illegitimate. This act sowed the seeds for England's future, paving the way for the golden reigns that followed. Still, her life did not close in peace. After Henry's death in the year 1547, Catherine remarried Thomas Seymour, a decision made for love, but fraught with risk. The marriage brought her fleeting happiness, but also political entanglements. In the year 1548, Catherine died after giving birth to a daughter, her life ending in tragedy, but also in the fulfillment of her own desires. History remembers Catherine Parr as the most intelligent survivor among Henry's 6 wives. She mastered the art of survival in the Tudor court, knowing when to serve, when to bow, and when to preserve her own identity. In a world where women were treated as pawns in the game of power, Catherine Parr proved that wisdom itself could be the strongest weapon. On the 28th of January in the year 1547, Henry VIII closed his eyes for the last time, leaving behind a kingdom fractured like a battlefield after the storm. The Tudor dynasty, once glittering with pageantry, now lay scattered with wounds of religious strife, social divisions, and a weary people who both feared and loathed the king who had ruled them with iron and fire. His funeral was grand, but in the silence beneath the hymns, many breathed a sigh of relief that his reign of cruelty had finally ended. Upon the throne sat Edward VI, the only surviving son of Jane Seymour, just 9 years old. A boy, barely free of childhood's haze, was thrust beneath a crown far too heavy. The palace was no place for children. Power quickly slipped into the hands of his Protestant regents, who used him as a symbol rather than a sovereign. Reforms surged forward. Catholic rites were abolished, yet the promise did not endure. In the year 1553, only 4 years into his reign, Edward breathed his last, remembered as the youngest Tudor king to die. The throne once again became a burning seat no one could hold for long. After Edward came Mary I, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Mary carried the restless hunger to restore Catholicism, to vindicate her mother's memory. But her dream turned into fire and smoke. Hundreds of Protestants were burned at the stake, their cries tangled with prayers as ash filled the air. The people named her Bloody Mary, a queen who ruled by fear. Within the palace, dread seeped into every wall. Mary found no peace. Nor did she hold the throne long. After only 5 years, she died, leaving behind a reign that was remembered with both horror and pity. Then emerged Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn. She inherited not only sharp beauty but also the lessons of survival, written in blood by the women before her. Elizabeth crowned herself in a realm cracked by doubt, by suspicion, and by the same religious divisions that had never healed. But she knew the game, for she had grown up in the palace where every whisper could turn into a blade. Her reign lasted 45 years, hailed as a golden age, yet it was built on delicate balancing acts between faith, politics, and her own survival. Looking back, none of Henry's 3 children, Edward, Mary, or Elizabeth, found peace on the throne. Edward died too young. Mary was scarred with infamy, and Elizabeth wore the armour of the Virgin Queen to endure. The legacy of Henry VIII was not merely a dynasty. It was a deep fissure within the nation, a bloody reformation, a chain of political upheavals, and a monarchy that never again stood still. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Anne Boleyn, ascended the throne in the year 1558, after the death of Mary I. She inherited the crown at the age of 25. But it was not only a glittering crown, it was a haunted mirror, reflecting the tragedies of the women who came before her. Elizabeth knew that every step she took echoed back to Henry VIII's bedchamber, where queens had been judged solely by their ability to produce sons. And so she chose a different path, the path of solitude. She declared herself the Virgin Queen, not because purity was sacred, but because it was her political armor. Elizabeth refused to become a pawn in dynastic marriages, refused to let her womb become the property of the crown. Instead, she crafted the image of being the Bride of England, symbolically offering her devotion to her nation rather than to any man. This allowed her to reject the proposals of French princes, the King of Spain, and dukes from the Netherlands, while still maintaining delicate diplomatic balance. Her reign, remembered as the Elizabethan Age, was not merely a political chapter. It was a cultural awakening. Shakespeare staged plays that shaped literature forever. Francis Drake sailed the seas, bringing glory and treasures. Music, art, and pride flourished, and England emerged not as a follower, but as a formidable force on Europe's stage. But Elizabeth's strength was not born from luck. It came from harsh lessons carved into her memory. She had seen her mother, Anne Boleyn, executed for failing to bear a son. She had seen her half-sister Mary branded Bloody Mary for her obsession with restoring Catholicism. She learned from their downfall and transformed those scars into guidance. A queen could only endure by never allowing herself to be defined by marriage. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years, longer than any of Henry VIII's other children. She not only safeguarded the throne, but also forged an independent English identity, distinct from Rome, France, or Spain. Under her, the kingdom grew powerful, but more importantly, she proved that a woman could rule without leaning on a husband. In this way, Elizabeth was not merely Anne Boleyn's daughter. She became the brightest legacy born out of the dark tragedies of Henry VIII's 6 wives. The journey of Henry VIII's 6 wives is not merely a collection of personal tragedies, it exposes the raw essence of the Tudor court. At the very heart of power, royal marriage was never about love. It was a diplomatic tool, a political shackle, a battlefield where the bedchamber doubled as the throne room, and survival depended on producing a healthy son. Every woman who entered this cycle paid a price. Catherine of Aragon brought an entire Spanish kingdom as her dowry, yet when she failed to bear a son, she was cast aside like a surplus object. Anne Boleyn dared to challenge tradition, using wit and intelligence to become queen, only to be executed when her womb failed its duty. Jane Seymour seemed victorious when she delivered Edward, but 12 days later she lost her life to childbirth complications. Anne of Cleves stood as the rare exception, shrewdly withdrawing from the game, securing safety and peace. Catherine Howard was too young, too naive, and the executioner's blade closed her life at 19. Catherine Parr survived through wisdom and tact, but in the end, she too succumbed to the dangers of childbirth. The common thread uniting them is that all were victims of an authoritarian system in which Henry VIII, both king and head of the church, concentrated absolute power. For him, marriage was never a partnership between two individuals. It was a machine to satisfy his obsession with heirs and his drive for dominance. The women beside him were turned into symbols, instruments, pawns that could be replaced at will. That legacy, though tragic, leaves timeless lessons. It teaches us that gender inequality, unchecked authority, and systemic oppression can crush even the strongest of individuals. Yet it also shows that in the darkest corners, some women still shone with cunning, resilience, and quiet defiance. They may not have been whole, they may have been forgotten, but their choices planted the seeds of change. For our modern world, the lesson remains clear. In workplaces, relationships, and societies, power chambers still exist in many forms. But by remembering the painful legacy of the 6 Tudor queens, we learn to value equality, freedom, and dignity rights women continue to defend with unyielding courage. Across the centuries, the shadow of Henry VIII and his 6 wives has never faded from public imagination. You find them in old poems, in plays performed again and again, and on modern television screens where each figure is draped in splendor, yet beneath that finery lies heartbreak. These 6 marriages are no longer just royal affairs. They have become symbols of power struggles, desire, and the fragility of human life. Today, when people think of Henry, many call him the king who beheaded his wives. But if you pause and look deeper, you'll see the real story isn't only about blood and blades. It's about women fighting to survive under the crushing weight of the throne and the sword. Catherine of Aragon, with courage, stood before the court and openly defied her husband, declaring their marriage lawful and her honour untouchable. Anne Boleyn, with wit and sharp intelligence, shook the church itself, even though she ultimately fell to the executioner's blade. Jane Seymour, who briefly held joy in her arms with the birth of Edward, lost her life almost immediately after. Anne of Cleves, with shrewd diplomacy, stepped away from the deadly game and outlived them all. Catherine Howard, at 19, was too young, too unguarded, swept away by the storm of power. And Catherine Parr, learned and patient, not only survived but also paved the way for Elizabeth's rise to the throne. Together, their fates form a tapestry of history that still chills us when revisited. And Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne, by declaring herself the Virgin Queen, transformed her mother's tragedy into strength, holding power entirely on her own terms. The Tudor story, if you look closely, is an eternal reminder. Absolute power must always be checked. When marriage becomes a political tool and love becomes a contract, the first thing sacrificed is humanity, followed swiftly by life itself. These women show us that living in the shadow of the crown did not mean total helplessness. In their forced smiles, whispered words, silent endurance, or moments of defiance, they sent forward a message across time. The resilience of women can never be extinguished, even in the harshest of worlds. Looking back today, you don't just see a king infamous for violence and lust. You see the outlines of real people, women who endured, who fought, and who left behind legacies that cannot be erased. And that is why the story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives will never remain merely history. It is a mirror, a lesson, and a warning that still echoes into our own time. After decades of turmoil, the legacy of Henry VIII's 6 calculated marriages carved itself deep into the very foundations of England. You see, it wasn't just about a divorce. To free himself from Catherine of Aragon, Henry severed ties with Rome and crowned himself as the supreme head of a brand new church. Thus, the Church of England was born not from divine will, but from a king's bedchamber and stubborn pride. From that moment, the entire nation trembled under waves of religious upheaval. His decision ignited the Reformation, splitting Catholics and Protestants into bitter enemies. Churches ceased to be houses of prayer. They became battlegrounds where loyalty was measured by doctrine. Ordinary people were forced to choose sides, and often that choice meant life or death. Remember the uprising called the Pilgrimage of Grace. Tens of thousands of peasants and clergy marched in protest against the dissolution of monasteries and Henry's self-appointment as head of the church. They dreamed of peace, but instead, they met with brutal suppression and blood spilled across Yorkshire's fields. Inside the court, the atmosphere was just as volatile. Ministers, bishops, and courtiers twisted and turned to survive. One day they shouted for Protestant reform, the next day they knelt back to Catholic rights. Every sermon was a political statement, every prayer a declaration of allegiance. And when Henry died, his legacy lived on. Edward VI, his only surviving son, ascended at just 9 years old, enthralled by Protestant zeal, pushing reforms to extremes. Yet within 4 years, he was dead, leaving an unfillable void. Then came Mary I, Catherine's daughter, who swung violently in the opposite direction, reviving Catholicism and burning hundreds of Protestants alive, sealing her place in history as Bloody Mary. Finally, Elizabeth I rose to the throne, and with keen intelligence, she chose balance. Through her via media, the middle way, she shaped a church that leaned neither wholly Catholic nor entirely Protestant. It was just stable enough to hold the country together, just pragmatic enough to prevent further collapse. And from that compromise grew a Protestant England, paving the way for naval supremacy and the later British Empire. The sobering thought, and one you must hold on to, is where it all began. Not with a council of theologians, nor with a sweeping political movement, It began with one man's personal desire with a king's obsession over divorce, with his hunger for a male heir. From that obsession, tens of thousands suffered, faiths fractured, and society bled. You see, when absolute power rests in the hands of a single person, personal ambition becomes a nation's fate. And that, more than anything, was Henry VIII's most dangerous legacy. It wasn't only Henry VIII's 6 wives who suffered tragic fates. Those who stood beside the throne ministers, bishops, noble families, maids and attendants were all pawns on his ruthless chessboard. The Tudor court was not a serene palace of music and ceremony. It was a glittering theatre, its velvet curtains hiding blood-stained strings and sharpened blades. Thomas Cromwell, once the king's mighty right hand, orchestrated Anne Boleyn's downfall. From whispered gossip, he crafted accusations of adultery, even dragging her own brother into the web. Cromwell seemed untouchable, but the same wheel he set spinning eventually crushed him. When he fell from grace, he too faced the executioner, undone by the very machinery he had built. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop, acted as a silent scribe of fate. He drafted the divorce decrees, legitimized Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, and later blessed Anne of Cleves. Every stroke of his pen was a gamble, a wager with his life on the line, where one misstep could mean ruin. The great families Howard and Seymour played like gamblers at a dangerous table. When a queen from their bloodline reigned, they celebrated with toasts and promotions. But when fortune turned, entire clans collapsed overnight. A single charge, a single verdict, and their glory vanished into the shadow of the scaffold. And then there were the nameless ones, the ladies-in-waiting, the maids, the servants. They did not sit in councils or carry family crests, yet they too were swept into the storm. Many became unwilling witnesses, forced to testify to what they had seen or overheard. A glance, a whispered word at Mass, could lead to interrogation, beatings, or permanent disgrace. Imagine living in a world where even your smile could be read as treachery. A misplaced bow, a jewel too bright, or a careless word could send you to the block. No wonder Henry's England was whispered about as the most terrifying court in Europe. It was not merely a stage of power and splendour, but a machine that devoured human lives, whether queen, minister, or servant. Henry's obsession with power did not stop with marriage. It seeped into every corner of the palace, tainting even the air. Every stone corridor, every woven tapestry, carried the weight of whispers, oaths, and muffled cries. He ruled not only with laws and decrees, but with fear itself, turning it into his most effective weapon. That was the true tragedy. Under Henry's reign, no one was safe. Not only the wives who lost their heads, but bishops, ministers, and maids alike could vanish for a glance at the wrong time. The court was no longer a symbol of royal glory. It was a vast prison, trapping every soul inside the iron cage of one man's power. Amid the storms of intrigue, fragile strands of genuine emotion flickered briefly, only to be crushed beneath the grinding wheels of politics. Picture Catherine of Aragon, far from her homeland, sitting alone in her chapel, eyes damp with hidden tears, hands clasped tightly in prayer, clinging to her Catholic faith as her last refuge against betrayal and exile. Anne Boleyn, in contrast, yearned not just to be queen, but to be Henry's intellectual companion. In quiet moments, she dreamed aloud of reform, of a court guided by knowledge and humanity. Yet those dreams were twisted into accusations of heresy and treason. Jane Seymour left behind simple letters, pledging absolute loyalty to the king, as if humility itself could shield her from a ruthless fate. Anne of Cleves, with quiet wisdom, poured her affection into the royal children, choosing to act as a kind aunt within the storm of the court rather than compete for a crown. Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, rebelled in small ways, grieving her stolen youth. Her laughter, her girlish glances, were transformed into evidence of betrayal. Catherine Parr, the last wife, longed for something deceptively simple, yet dangerously bold. Intellectual freedom. To read, to write, to leave a legacy of thought rather than just a name in a royal ledger. And yet, every whisper of these inner lives was buried beneath piles of indictments, icy death sentences, and rigid religious decrees. To Henry, they were not women of flesh and feeling capable of love, pain, and dreams. They were shadows, permitted to exist only as long as they fulfilled impossible conditions. Total obedience, the birth of a son, and the flawless image required to polish his power. Love in the Tudor court was never love at all. It was a performance draped in crimson, perfumed with incense, and scored with the sounds of trumpets. And when the performance ended, what remained were cold chambers, bitter memories, and a hollow loneliness. They loved, they hoped, but history remembers them only as fragments in a grim nursery rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. The tragic circle of Henry VIII did not close in the 16th century. It left scars that stretched across centuries, etched deep into Europe's structures of power. Thrones remained bound to patriarchy. Even when women reached the heights of monarchy, they had to prove themselves through greater resilience and sharper wisdom than any man. Just as Elizabeth I, the lion-hearted queen, ruled not only as a sovereign but also as a symbol, showing the world that a queen could match, and even surpass, kings in a male-dominated realm. The obsession with heirs became a haunting legacy. From France to Spain to Russia, dynasties yearned for male successors. Marriages ceased to be about affection. They became high-stakes bargains. A young princess might be sent abroad to secure a treaty, her worth measured by the sons she could bear. Within this cycle, women became chess pieces ornate, precious, but easily replaced. Tragically, Henry VIII's legacy endured not only in politics but also in popular culture. We recall him through the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. A chant that sounds playful, yet behind it lie blood and tears. History normalized the suffering of women as a spectacle. On stage, in literature, and in film, Henry is remembered as a tyrant of flamboyant power. While his wives are compressed into footnotes, their lives diminished to side characters in his drama. Even in the modern world, echoes of Tudor lessons remain. Scholars, leaders, and strategists cite that era to illustrate the might of concentrated authority, the necessity of alliances, and the dual power of beauty and intellect. Yet behind each lesson stands a terrible cost: lives cut short, happiness sacrificed, and the dignity of women trampled. Looking back, you see that this tragic circle was never just the story of one dynasty. It is a mirror of society itself, where male authority was magnified, and women were bound by rigid expectations. Henry VIII may have died long ago, but his shadow still lingers, reminding us that unchecked power transforms love into duty, and human beings into victims of their own histories. 4 centuries have passed, yet the story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives still resonates deeply because of its humanity and timeless lessons. You see, no one should ever have their dignity and life suspended on the fragile thread of power. These women, Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, lived and loved like anyone else, yet they were reduced to pawns in a brutal political game. And when love was stripped away by politics, what remained were scars that never truly healed. Elizabeth I, the only daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, stands as the most vivid legacy of that world. She reached the heights of glory that we now call the Golden Age, transforming England into a cultural and political beacon of Europe. Shakespeare, Drake, the great voyages all flourished under her reign. Yet behind the glittering crown, Elizabeth carried her own fears. Fear of family collapse, after witnessing her mother's execution and the downfall of her predecessors. Fear of politics, knowing that a single misstep could send her back to the cold Tower of London. Fear of her position, as the throne she held was always fragile, burdened by the expectations Henry left behind. Today, when we look back, we see that the Tudor story never really disappeared. It lives on in films, in glittering stage musicals, in novels that reimagine the past. Each retelling is not just distant tragedy, but a ringing alarm. Absolute power corrupts. When men hold everything, women are judged by their wombs, silenced by their failures, and discarded when no longer useful. How? And so the lesson remains, unchanged after 4 centuries. Women still fight for the right to live, to love, to be respected. What Catherine of Aragon endured with pride, Anne Boleyn with wit, Jane Seymour with fleeting sacrifice, Anne of Cleves with clever diplomacy, Catherine Howard with youthful naivety, Catherine Parr with intelligence and resilience All of it weaves into a chorus of courage. Each story you've just heard, whispered at night like a bedtime tale, instead awakens the heart. It awakens you to remember that freedom and equality are not privileges, but basic rights. It awakens you to never forget that behind the simple rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, were lives, hopes, and tears of real human beings. And so, through today's video, you've walked with me through the shadows and tragedies of 6 women forever tied to the name Henry VIII. From the steadfast Catherine of Aragon to the cunning Anne Boleyn, from the gentle Jane Seymour to the shrewd Anne of Cleves, from the naive Catherine Howard to the wise Catherine Parr, they were never just the king's wives. They were human beings, flesh and blood, carrying dreams, beliefs, and wounds that never healed. The message you can carry forward goes beyond history. It reaches into the present, that every person, especially women, deserves the right to live as themselves, not as tools, not as pawns for ambition. That love only holds meaning when it is rooted in respect and freedom, and that history, if we refuse to confront it, has a way of repeating itself in different forms. You can apply these lessons to modern life. Learn to protect yourself, dare to raise your voice when needed, and above all, cherish human values in love, in family, and in society. Tudor history is not just dusty pages in a book. It is a mirror reflecting our world today. Finally, if you're still awake, I wish you a peaceful night's sleep. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the newest and most meaningful stories we'll share together. Sleep well.